Empire of Anguish. The cursed empire of Dolorum was a place of depthless grief and terror, a monument to Lady Olynder's doomed ambition. Since the ruler of the Night Haunt assumed the title of Mortarch, it had never once been put to siege, for only the damned could set foot in such a place without succumbing to a hideous fate. The capital of Dolorum was the ill-fated citadel of Silontum, the true seat of Lady Olynder's power. As befitting the stronghold of a Mortarch, it was a place of dark and terrible glory, populated by swirling hosts of ethereal warriors, and protected against trespassers by the vilest curses imaginable. An aura of such utter desolation lay over this city of the dead that it would be death for any mortal to set foot within its walls. Stricken by supernatural grief, they would collapse in an instant, their heart freezing in their chest, even as their soul was dragged screaming from their body. Amongst the Mortarch of Grief's many enemies, none was more implacable than the faithless of mortal kind. The Dark Master Belakor was one such foe. His sword, the Blade of Shadows, had already bitten deep into Olynder's spectral form once before, banishing her from the realms of the living. It was a slight that the Mortarch had sworn to avenge 100-fold, yet Belakor had no intention of allowing Olynder to strike the next blow in this simmering feud. It was ever the Demon Prince's strategy to attack when and where his opponents least expected him to. The Dark Master had at his command an entire legion of unnatural horrors whose very nature rendered them resistant to Silontum's enervating aura. Centuries ago, Belakor had secured several secret passages into the realm of death, for he knew that one day the hosts of chaos and death must fight for the right to feast upon the souls of the living. It was through one such realm gate that the legion of the first prince would pass in order to reach the underworlds and march upon the gloom-laden spires of Silontum itself. Belakor, the Dark Master. The malevolent being known as Belakor is the first and greatest of Daemon princes, an iron-willed tyrant that has preyed upon mortal kind since long before the mortal realms came into being. By his hand have countless heroes met their end, and mighty civilizations been consumed by shadow and terror. The fell legend of the Dark Master begins in the mist-shrouded prehistory of the world that was. Belakor was once a mortal warlord of great renown, whose ruthlessness and lust for power caught the gaze of the Chaos Pantheon. Recognizing Belakor as a potential vessel through which they could achieve dominance over all mortals, the dark gods raised him up to become a demon prince, the first living being to ever receive such a dark blessing. Invested with a portion of each god's might, Belakor represented the true power of chaos undivided. It is not known how or why Belakor lost the favor of his patrons. Some say that he attempted to rebel against the dark gods, seeking to claim their power as his own. Others say that he was defeated in a cataclysmic battle by an ancient hero of the light and condemned to an eternity of ignominy for his failure. Whatever the truth, his time as the foremost champion of chaos was over. The dark gods would instead put their faith in a series of mortal warlords known as the Ever-Chosen. Most humiliatingly of all, Belakor was cursed never to receive that profane title himself, but instead would be forced to inaugurate each new Ever-Chosen with the artifact known as the Crown of Domination, a helm currently worn by Archaon. What Belakor's role in such stories is unclear. Myths and rumors surround Belakor, like coiling wisps of shadow, for the Dark Master knows better than any the power of deception. If any creature in existence has surmised the truth of his origins and motivations, it is only because their knowledge somehow suits Belakor's purpose. Despite his fall from grace, Belakor remains one of mortal kind's most implacable foes, a tyrant and manipulator whose fell influence can be felt across the vast expanse of the mortal realms. Though robbed of the status his towering ego craves, Belakor is nonetheless one of the most powerful of the Dark God's agents, who through sheer, dominating force of will has assembled the enormous host known as the Legion of the First Prince to do his bidding, consisting of demons of all aspects and allegiances that have been coerced, lured, or forcibly leashed into obeying the Dark Master's will. This personal army has scoured entire continents at the Demon Prince's behest. Given their fractious history, it is little surprise that Belakor does not bother to conceal his outright hatred for Archaon the Ever-Chosen. The two warlords may have fought alongside one another more than once against the armies of the God King and the other great powers of the realms, but each would gladly see the other humiliated and broken. Likely, their mutual enmity amuses the Dark Gods, who delight in playing the two off against one another. While Archaon meets his enemies with direct and catastrophic violence, Belakor is a subtler creature. He weaves his plots and realm-spanning schemes from the darkness, sowing seeds that will lead to the destruction of civilizations and the ruin of kings. Shadow and terror are his weapons, confusion and uncertainty the poisons he employs to weaken his prey before the kill. Not all battles can be won from the shadows, however. When the Dark Master deems it necessary, he will take to the field in all his fell glory, wielding the blade of shadows with skill honed across centuries of slaughter. Possessed of the full might of a Daemon Prince, Belakor can tear an armored knight in two with a flex of his corded muscles, and soar over a castle wall with a beat of his leathery wings. For all his unnatural potency, Belakor cares nothing for honor. A masterful sorcerer, he delights in humiliating his opponents, hurling hexes and shadow curses to sap their strength, bind their limbs, or strike them dumb with crippling visions of loss and despair. Rise of the First Prince. Throughout the early centuries of the Age of Sigmar, Belakor was content to allow Archaon and his endless legions to bear the brunt of the war against the God King and his allies. The Dark Master took to the battlefields of the mortal realms only when he deemed it beneficial, and never to do so would have angered the Dark Gods beyond reason. All the while, his network of demonic and mortal spies laid the groundwork for his eventual rise to power, identifying weaknesses in his foes that might be exploited, and seizing artifacts and rare troves of arcane lore that might prove vital in the wars to come. While his rivals' armies were diminished by a cycle of ceaseless, attritional battle, the Legion of the First Prince slowly expanded its influence, a shadowy corruption spreading its way through the armies of chaos, inch by inch. It was a great demonic host acting under Belakor's orders that smashed the great prophetic engine of Tepok's eye, blinding the Slann to his machinations. It was by his design that the location of the Eater of Tomes' Silver Tower was revealed to the Seraphon, for the Dark Master's plans rested upon the obliteration of that eldritch structure. And it was his shadowy agents that freed the Lord Veritant Kaiser, Venbrecht, from his imprisonment at the hands of the newly risen goddess Morate, thus ensuring that word reached Azir of the Cainites' betrayal and their brutal annexation of the free city of Anvilgard. When word came that both Hish and Shyish were aflame, the ancient grudge between Teclis and Nagash once more spilling over into outright war, Belakor knew that the decisive moment had at last arrived. With the great powers of the realms distracted and embroiled in bitter fighting and recriminations, there would be no one to oppose Belakor's schemes. By the time that the weakling deities of order realized their doom, it would be too late. The Dark Master would claim his rightful inheritance as the foremost champion of the Dark Gods, and the skies themselves would burn in the fires of his ambition. An infernal plan. The entity known as Belakor had plagued mortal kind since before the formation of the 8 realms, plotting from the shadows to murder kings and send empires toppling into ruin. Yet the daemon's latest plan was on an altogether more ambitious scale. He sought nothing less than to cripple the armies of Sigmar by cutting them off from the realm of heavens. From his shadow-wreathed throne, the demon Belakor looked down upon the teeming masses of his legion. All the hideous panoply of chaos was represented there. Sulphur-spitting cohorts of bloodletters stood beside languorous demons of Slanesh, hated foes who would have gladly flayed one another were it not for the shadow brand stitched into their flesh. This was the mark of Belakor, a dark sigil powerful enough to bind even the children of the ruinous powers into his service. Even several greater demons had sworn fealty to the Dark Master, though their allegiance had been acquired through manipulation and coercion rather than force, for such beings could not be bound as easily as their minions. Many others, such as the feared demon princes of Orb Infernia, had temporarily set aside their mutual hatred and answered the summons of the first prince, further swelling his power. Belakor rose from his throne and unfurled his wings to their full span, the rattling of the hooked chains that festooned them silencing the anarchic horde arrayed beneath him. When he spoke, his voice dripped with the malice of eons. Archaon, the false king, had failed, Belakor proclaimed. Where was he now, even as the enemy ravaged his domain, and the armies of the great necromancer seized land, long promised to the dark gods? The ever-chosen king's absence betrayed his weakness. He had known victory in his grasp, and allowed it to slip away. For all his fire and fury, said Belakor, Archaon was still a mortal, lacking both the desire and the power to break the realms to his will. A true chosen of the dark gods would never fail so terribly. It was time for the command of the great apocalypse to fall into worthier hands. Belakor had watched and he had waited, and now he would strike, cutting the throat of the God-King's armies in a single, devastating blow. Long had the Dark Master desired to unpick the foundations of the realms. Nagash's efforts in Hish to collapse realm gates into life-draining vortices had proven that these ancient edifices could be destroyed, as had Archaon's attempts at corrupting them using Varanite. Yet it was the obliteration of the Silver Tower in Shamon that had proffered the final part of the puzzle. It was possible to not just destroy a realm gate, by exposing it to tremendous arcane forces, but to cause a chain reaction that would overload and detonate other realm gates linked to that same mystical pathway. A series of such massive implosions occurring simultaneously would tear open the skin of the mortal realms and spill the energies of chaos into reality, turning the very skies into a churning maelstrom of cursed magic. This would choke the God King's empire to death, for such would be the trauma caused that it would sever the connection between Azir and the other realms, leaving the Stormcast Eternals stranded in the field. There, they could be worn down and destroyed at leisure. Unwittingly, the Seraphon had unlocked the final gate, barring the way to Belakor's ascension. No doubt they had judged the damage caused to the Realm Gate network by their destruction of the Eater of Tomes' lair as a price worth paying to end his experiments. Little did the Star Lizards realize that Belakor's armies stood ready to exploit this trauma, to plant a perfect arcane storm that would see the tides of chaos spill across Shamon and beyond. It was a risky stratagem. The Dark Master's plan called for his forces to destroy some of the corrupted portals that had for so long granted demonic hosts access to mortal lands. Archaon would never have countenanced it, for he was warlord above all. He would never willingly sacrifice his armies' main routes of conquest that had served them so long and so well, let alone sanction the destruction of such powerful assets as the towers themselves. But the Dark Master was gambling that with Sigmar's armies so gravely disrupted, the balance of power would be shifted dramatically in the Great War. Demons would run rampant once more, and a second age of chaos would surely dawn. Belakor had a task for each demonic warlord present, a pattern of attacks so complex and devious that only a being of his ancient malevolence could have come up with it. It would begin in Shamon, for there the membrane separating the realm from the roiling tides of madness was weakest. The legion of the first prince was to set the realm of metal aflame. When the time was right, Belakor would reveal his hand and join the fight in person. But for now he had another wheel to set in motion. Death's vengeance. It had been during the great battle for the 8 Points, when Belakor fought alongside his hated rival Archaon, that he first battled the Empress Lady Olynder, Mortarch of Grief. In that climactic duel, the Dark Master had banished his foe's spirit form back to the underworlds of Shyish with the Blade of Shadows. Yet in recent days, he had been afflicted by sensations that were quite unfamiliar to him. A cloying paranoia and a dreadful cold that he could not quite dismiss. Further still, it seemed to the Dark Master that the color had drained from the world around him, save for a sinister, emerald glow at the edge of his vision. Belakor was far from a stranger to malign magics. He knew the touch of a curse when he felt it, though he was surprised and impressed by the strength of the rage that so plainly gave the hex its potency. Such lingering enmity could prove most useful, he thought. Belakor knew that if he did nothing but wait for Lady Olynder's wrath to fall upon him, with her most powerful sorceries likely swelled only to send her or her agents back to their lightless afterlife for an indeterminate span. With the Mortarch of Grief as an enemy, his careful plans were at risk of being thrown into disarray. Yet perhaps there was a way to turn her vengeance, her wrath, as a way to remove her. So it was that the legion of the first prince laid siege to Dolorum, spilling out of ancient shadow gates known only to Belakor. The Dark Master himself led the assault, guarded by a quartet of greater demons who all bore his brand upon their flesh. Holding high the blade of shadows, the Dark Master ordered his lesser minions forward, and a tide of demons poured down the slopes of the screaming wastes towards the crumbling walls and austere manse palaces of Ceylontum. Dolorum's ancient capital. They were met in shrieking horde of wrathful spirits, roused by ancient bonds of servitude to defend their mistress's homeland for eternity. Plague-bearers trudged into storms of howling geists, swiping with rusted blades, while wedge-shaped stampedes of bloodletters atop snorting juggernauts smashed their way through mortuary fields the size of cities. At the height of the siege, 1,000-strong host of chain rasps swept out from the morbid spires of Dolorum's capital, led by soaring columns of hex-wraiths and clattering black coaches. And while total anarchy played out across Ceylontum, Belakor and his most vaunted demonic champions plunged into the depths of the capital, seeking Olynder's most closely guarded secret. In the court of death, at the heart of Ceylontum lay the sanctum of anguish. Here, in this profane chamber, Lady Olynder's skeletal remains were stored within a crystal coffin and protected by the vilest curses that the Mortash could devise. Yet even these terrible wards could not keep the Dark Master at bay. The inner sanctums of Ceylontum were twisting and treacherous, guarded by the fiercest spirits in thrall to Lady Olynder. The aura of tragedy that hung over the place was choking in its intensity, and a heart-stopping chorus of wailing banshee song echoed through its crystalline spires. Any mortal army setting foot in such a dread place would find itself overcome with grief, its soldiers sinking hopeless to the floor to be raked to death by the talons of outraged geists. Even the demonic host of the Dark Master was not entirely immune to such potent horror. Many of Belakor's lesser servants faded into nothingness, as emotions that gave them physical form were entirely suffocated by grief. Time, Belakor knew, was not on his side. The great assault upon the gates of Ceylontum would only divert the Night Haunt's ruler for a short while. As Belakor advanced, the Mortarch of Grief was battling before the walls of the outer gate with so many Dreadscythe Harridans and Meremorn banshees. Her fury at the brazenness of the attack was absolute. With a curling fist, she choked the animus from the invaders. With deathly curses she withered their unnatural flesh to ash, and sent their essence screaming back to their hellish realm. The choir joined their voices in a terrible refrain, and as the keening notes of their song swept across the battlefield, Belakor's minions writhed and collapsed in agony. The infernal spells hurled by demonic wizards sputtered and died before flocks of Meremorn banshees swept down to assail the casters with a terrible hunger, for they feasted on arcane energies as vultures do on carrion. What was the reason for this doomed assault, the Mortarch wondered. Even the Lady Olynder had not believed any foe foolish enough to strike her here, where she was at her most powerful. What need did the Night Haunt have to repair Ceylontum's time-worn walls when the very aura of the dead city would suffice to repel any army? True, the demons had caused much damage, breaking into her seat of power to rampage and desecrate, but their hopes of victory were as naught. Yet it was at that moment she felt a tremor of unease, the first she had felt in many centuries. Her unliving essence was linked inextricably with the city of her rise and her fall. And in a sudden rush of insight, Olynder could feel a potent demonic presence drawing nearer to the sanctum of anguish, the one place where she might, in fact, be vulnerable. How had the enemy known to strike her there? She had thought the location of her mortal remains to be a secret known only to her master, Nagash. With a scream of outrage that echoed across the battlefield and froze the choir of even raging bloodletters, the Mortarch of Grief took to the skies, her entourage flocking after her. Darkness aligned. A banshee's bitter scream was cut short as Belakor thrust the blade of shadows through her chest, the cursed weapon cleaving her spectral form as easily as it would plunge through solid metal. The demon prince sneered in satisfaction as the spirit juddered and twisted, and then burst apart in one most unnatural battle. Belakor's demons fought tides of geists swooping down from the spires of Silontum in their hundreds, battling the deathly spells and grave blades of the Night Haunt with untrammeled ferocity. The Dark Master stepped to the wrought iron gates that sealed the resting place of the Mortarch's bones, and began to hiss an incantation of unbinding. This spell of banishment had been sought out at great cost by the Dark Master's most cunning agents, shadow demons from Ulgu, who had breached the halls of Uchlontis to spy upon the rituals of Olynder's court. Belakor's cadre of demonic heralds joined his chanting, save for the Bloodmasters of Khorne, who snarled and howled in contempt at the scent of such powerful magic. Hopelessly bound in servitude to the first prince, they nonetheless turned their rage against the spectral dead as the Dark Master's magic bored through the wards that protected the Mortarch of Grief's resting place. The gates of the sanctum warped and groaned beneath the arcane torrent. Just then, a chilling green glow flooded the battlefield. From came the Mortarch of Grief and all her sorrow-morn choir at the head of the dread emerald host. As the Night-Haunt Queen surged towards Belakor, sweeping aside all in her path, spat the words of a spell of duplicity. The Daemon Prince split into 4 shadowy mirror images of himself, each of which rushed the Mortarch with its claws outstretched. Olynder struck down the illusions one by one, but the distraction had already bought Belakor the time he needed. With a single beat of his wings, the Dark Master leapt up the marbled stairway of the sanctum to the sarcophagus at its summit, which rested upon a great bier of black crystal and lacquered bone. It was surrounded by a thick nest of black roses, which lashed out at the demon prince as he stepped close, seeking to bind him in their deathly embrace for daring to intrude in this place of sorrow. Yet the blade of shadows swept out, first shearing the plants at the root, and then shattering the sarcophagus. Inside, withered and horrible, lay the remains of the Lady Olynder, her waxy skin kept from rotting by Silontum's master embalmers. Here, then, was the Mortarch's fatal weakness, and the very source of her tortured being, her sole link to the past, and the mortal regent she had once been. With but a single stroke, Belakor might free the mortal realms of her cursed existence for all time. Up came the Dark Master's blade, and the Mortarch gave loose a scream of such bitterness that it caused all of the Night Haunt in Silontum to wail in despair. Belakor swept the blade of shadows down. Its edge came to rest upon the crown worn by the Mortarch's corpse. "With a single blow I might end you, spirit," hissed the first prince. The blade of shadows pulsed, bleeding pure darkness from the runes graven on its surface. Would that be a mercy, I wonder? Almost imperceptibly, something beneath the Mortoc's veil writhed and quivered. Then the fabric settled upon the ridge of her eyeless sockets once more. With a raised hand, she ordered her handmaidens to halt. Their outraged screeching was immediately silenced. "You will not kill me," the lady whispered, her voice the scraping of glass on stone. "And my curse upon you will not end with my doom. Do as you will, abomination, and pray you can strike your blow before I turn the air to ice." She drifted towards her foe, frost blanketing the ground before her approach. Belakor smiled, his fangs ice-white in the gloom of the chamber. "You mistake me, Queen of Sorrow. I did not come here seeking your destruction. I merely required you to hear my words. A change is coming to the realms. The world of mortals is crumbling. A black rot spreads in the heart of Hysh, thanks to your own master's work. By my order, the last survivor of Marathi's instrument has been freed, and even now brings word of her betrayal to the court of the vengeful Sigmar. It is but the dying embers of a foolish hope that keeps the dream of civilization alive. With your aid, I shall snuff out that pitiful light." Lady Olynder circled the demon. The mention of hope filled her with revulsion. It was the antithesis to grief, and an emotion she despised with all her cursed being. "You wish for an alliance," she said. If the Mortoc had been capable of humor, she would have found the thought amusingly preposterous. "But our feud is not done, creature. I remember the touch of your sword, and you, in turn, surely feel the curse I have laid upon you." "You and I are immortal," said Belakor. "What meaning does time have for creatures such as we? The quarrel can surely wait until the doom of mortals has been decided. And I have one more thing to offer in return. Join your cause to mine, and Sigmar's champions will no longer escape your master's clutches. They will soon lose what renders them eternal. For even now my armies strike at the gates between realms. When my work is done, their connection to Azir will be severed. Their spirits yours to do with as you wish." Silence stretched across the sanctum of anguish for many moments. Then the Mortoc began to trace a symbol in the air with her fingers. She wrote into being a spectral hourglass, which loomed over the head of the Dark Master. "You have until the sands run dry to do as you say," Olynder said, and even as she spoke, the first specks of ethereal sand trickled from the upper chamber of the hourglass. "Until this hour, the Legion of Grief will fight at your side, to shatter the spirits of all mortals. Then, and now I shall have our reckoning, Shadow Thing." Belakor's eyes did not even glance to the apparition above him, which now faded into nothingness. Instead, he gave a solemn bow and drew his blade away from Olynder's remains. Midnight wings arced out behind him. He summoned a whirling vortex of umbral magic, which yawned open in the still air of the sanctum of anguish. "Until we meet again, Spirit Queen," he said. Then he stepped into the darkness and was gone. Chain reaction. Even as Belakor and Lady Olynder formed a tentative alliance, the Dark Master's vast personal army, the Legion of the First Prince, was striking out across Chamon, attacking those realm gates identified by Belakor as weak points along the geomantic network that linked the mortal realms. The assault upon the realms enacted by the Legion of the First Prince was no grand offensive, but a series of strikes and betrayals of such complexity that to the majority of onlookers they would seem random in nature. This had ever been the nature of Belakor's malignant designs. Never did the Dark Master seek to attack his foes on equal ground. Instead, he relied upon the subtle blades of confusion and shock to deal a mortal blow before the enemy knew they were endangered. Though Belakor's armies would be dispatched to wreak ruin across the realms, his prime targets remained those realm gates that had been significantly destabilized by the detonation of the Silver Tower in the rusted wastes. These portals, all of which lay within the boundaries of Shamon, close to where the disaster had occurred, were uniquely vulnerable. Their ancient foundations had been sorely weakened by the immense arcane forces released by the death of Silver Tower. Some were already in the hands of the Dark God's followers. Others were fortified by Sigmar's agents or their allies. All were to be destroyed at any cost. When these sites were sabotaged and corrupted beyond recovery, then would the cascade of chaos energy spill forth to stain the realm's skies and sever their link to the realm of heavens. Belakor's alliance with Olynder had not been formalized beyond their fleeting covenant in the Sanctum of Anguish, and the two would not join their forces as in the manner of trusted allies. Instead, the Dark Master sent word to the court of Olynder through his messengers, the flocks of bat-like furies that haunted the spires of Mordekar in their thousands. The Nighthaunt would sow fear and confusion, as was their nature, diverting the God King's armies away from the key sites that Belakor had marked for destruction. When the skies burned in the aftermath of Belakor's triumph, and the time came for the final blow against the God King's champions, Lady Olynder would fight beside the very being she had sought to end, an event that Belakor knew no Stormcast Eternal would ever anticipate. It began without warning, across the ever-shifting expanse of the realm of metal. Sometimes the corruption of the land was so potent that it allowed the demons' passage to assault their quarry. When necessary, the way was opened by mortals loyal to the Dark Master through rituals of the most repulsive kind. The skies darkened and soured with sinister magics, and the scent of brimstone and burned blood filled the air as demons in their thousands surged forth to obey the will of Belakor. At the shining portal of Gutika, 3 lords of change led a rout of its Lumineth guardians, burning the elves in their watchtowers, and collapsing the realm gate in a storm of mutative magic. The Viridian path pools were taken, their waters boiled with such horrendous toxins that the underwater gateways imploded, causing a tsunami that engulfed an entire enclave of Dork Silverneth. In the lands bordering the crater that had replaced the rusted wastes, many realm gates were terribly vulnerable due to the magical fallout around the epicenter of the Silver Tower's destruction. Belakor's demonic sorcerers channeled volatile magic into their fractured foundations, pulsing apart their ancient enchantments and setting off yet more chain reactions that rippled out across reality. Not even fellow entities of chaos were safe from the demon prince's treachery. Belakor's plan called for demon to turn against demon, a grandarchy that transcended all hierarchies of command and servitude. Bloodletters wet their blades with the sulphurous ichor of their kin, and then turned their fury upon the very corrupted realm gates that had for so long allowed them ingress to the realms. Daemonettes turned upon their mortal sycophants, exulting in the agonized shock of their victims. Everywhere, it seemed, Lady Olynder's legion of grief was on the attack, sweeping down from on high to fall upon mortal garrisons and unprepared strong points, dispatching them for writ across their praise faces, as spectral talons sliced them apart from the inside. Forth came nightmares from the deepest, darkest places of the Shire-Shan underworlds, blade-limbed wraiths, banshees that gorged themselves upon magic, and skeletal masters of excruciation bound to the very tools they used to torment their victims. Unlike the legion of the first prince, the Mortarch's spectral hosts did not concentrate upon vulnerable realm gates, but instead struck at isolated outposts, strong points, and columns of troops marching at desperate speed to relieve their besieged comrades. So thick and fast came the predations of the spirit armies that many mortals were convinced a second necroquake had been loosed upon the realms. Free cities closed their gates, and fire-slayer lodges made ready to defend their sacred keeps. Had the daemonic assaults not coincided so perfectly with this night-haunt surge, likely the followers of the God King would have identified the true threat building in Shamon. As it was, confusion and paranoia ruled. Such had been Belakor's plan all along. From his seat of power, Mordekar, the Dark Master, observed the spreading anarchy with a satisfied leer and hurled fresh hosts into the field.